Welcome to the webinar, How to Set Boundaries, both in work and personal life. Today's webinar is brought to you by OpenUp. OpenUp is the platform for mental well-being. Via the OpenUp platform, you can book a one-on-one consultation with a psychologist, watch webinars like this one, work on your mental health via self-help programs, mental health checks, and more. Today we're going to talk about setting boundaries. OpenUp psychologists Jan and Fleur will tell you why it's so hard to set boundaries, the steps you should take when setting boundaries, and why setting boundaries is so important. Amongst others, research has shown that people that are good at setting boundaries do better at work, are less likely to face a burnout, and have better relationships. If you want to discuss a personal situation with one of our psychologists, that's possible. If your employer offers OpenUp, you can do so free of charge. If your employer doesn't offer OpenUp, the first consultation is still free of charge, and then after the first consultation, our psychologists will tell you what you can do to start working on setting boundaries, and if you can do so by yourself, or if we should book in more consultations. I'm excited to hear more from Jan and Fleur. I hope you are too, because we're about to start.
Well, good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon. My name is Jan, and I'm a work and organizational psychologist from OpenUp. And together with Fleur van der Maaten, I will kick off this webinar about setting boundaries. So, as you can see on the screen, setting boundaries is a part of life and part of self-care. They are healthy, normal, and necessary. So we will all run into setting boundaries or having our boundaries in our life, at all stages in our life. Imagine when we were little, we would discover the power of the word no. And maybe parents will laugh a little bit because it's a certain stage in life in which we all go through. And as a teenager, we are noticing that our parents are trying to limit us in our behavior, and we are trying to find out what boundaries work for us. So, when thinking about setting your boundaries and in your current day-to-day life, you may run into some things that are unpleasant for you, or things that you do or do not want. You could think of this moment at work where a colleague made a remark at you that wasn't very pleasant for you or was very inappropriate. You could think about the distance someone stands away from you in the supermarket while you have boundaries set about keeping this strict. There are all kinds of forms and shapes when it comes to setting your boundaries, and today we can discuss it a little bit more. So, in a sense, today we will talk about why setting boundaries is important, why setting boundaries may be difficult for you, setting boundaries and in the sense of your involvement and influence, what your challenge can be when setting boundaries, why you should set boundaries at all and the positive sides of it, why no is okay, and Fleur will talk a little bit more about what you need to be able to set boundaries, the practical side of it, and a step-by-step plan to help you achieve it. Next to some additional tips that we can give you. So first of all, why is setting boundaries so important for you? Boundaries can help us experience what we do and do not want. In a way, it helps us live the life we want to live. Your boundaries are what you stand for. If you live to other people's boundaries, you may experience unpleasant situations as you are living by someone else's rules, norms, and values. So, when you run into new people, there is always a challenge that you will have to adapt and to match your boundaries to the other. So in order you will not differ too much from who you really are as a person. Why setting boundaries is so difficult? So one of the things is that you must know your limits before you can actually set them and monitor them. One of the ways to reach one of your limits is to actually experience them. Usually it's not a very pleasant situation, but it usually takes only once to actually feel that you have a boundary right there. Next to that, it's also about communicating that you have a boundary. You can recognize them, you can feel it, but it's a different act of sport to actually communicate it. Next to that, it may be difficult to prioritize yourself in a situation in which a lot of different expectations are managed. For example, maybe you're extremely exhausted, but you also want to be liked by other people and you want to show up to this party that you've been invited to. It may be difficult to bounce these things around. So, it's not always about setting boundaries, it's also about the parts in which you can involve yourself and in which you can influence the situation. Stephen Covey has designed a circle system in which we can identify which parts of life we are concerned with, which parts of life we can actually directly or indirectly influence, and which parts of life we can control. And I'll walk you through it step by step. The first circle is the circle of concern. It's the furthest away from the center, and you are the center. The circle of concern is about situations and people that you are involved with. And as an easy example, we can take the current measures that this corona situation is giving us. So, in a way, this affects everyone, all of us around you. But the problem with setting boundaries in the circle of concern is that you get easily frustrated about it. If you set boundaries in terms of how much distance everyone has to keep from you, it's very difficult to maintain that, and a lot of times people will not be listening or people will not know that that is your boundary. And that will lead to a lot of frustration for you. So in a way, you want to know that you cannot directly influence or control this part of your life. Next, a little closer to the center, is the circle of influence. It's about things that you can partially or indirectly influence. If we take the same example, when working from a distance, you may notice a slight disconnect or an upbuilding disconnect from your colleagues. We're all used to working online right now, and behind our laptops, sure, we can have a conversation, but we notice that it's usually about work, and not so much more the ease of conversation we have at the coffee machine, or at a public meeting, or something in between. So, you know this situation is not something you asked for, but the difference with the circle of concern is that this is something that you can do something about. But, one side note, you are dependent on other people in order to make a change. When looking at your boundaries, you can set your boundaries, you can recognize them, and you need the help of others in order to actually make a change. In the example about the connection with your coworkers, you could take the initiative and call up a colleague or a coworker that you haven't talked to in a long time. Or you could discuss this at your workplace or with your team in order to find ways to actually re-establish some connection. So the final circle, which is the closest to the center, is the circle of control. And this is about the things you can actually deliberately control yourself. An example we have is that you notice that this corona lifestyle has made it quite boring for you, and that you are living a gray kind of life. Nothing really exciting is happening lately because either you've exhausted all your options or this just isn't your lifestyle and you used to go out all the time. So maybe we can't change the situation, but we can change the way we deal with it and the way we approach it ourselves. So when we're looking at our boundaries, we can recognize them, we can talk about it, and we can take according action in order to change it towards the way we actually want to live. So in this example, we could try to find out new hobbies. We could try to spend some time with people we haven't seen in a while. And there are many ways to approach it. Maybe you can already think of some ideas. So, in order to help you set boundaries, it's important to also think about the challenge you can give yourself. In the first example, when we were talking about the circle of concern, we were talking about someone that felt really responsible for other people's behavior, and that was really frustrating. So this responsibility in itself is a really positive feat, but it takes a different spin, which makes it a very negative one. And in a model designed by Daniel Hoffman, we can together look at this in a way how we can challenge this sense of responsibility. So we're talking about the core quality, which is a sense of responsibility. By itself, great, but when we notice and you follow the arrow that you are going too far with this, it can lead to a pitfall. And the pitfall in this sense is that you're feeling over-responsible or too responsible, and this nags at you. This gives you a very negative feeling. This makes you feel stressed in the shoulders and constantly worrying about it. When we're talking about the allergy in this model, this is about people that take zero responsibility at all. And these people may irritate you immensely because you value this sense of responsibility. And people that show zero of it aren't probably your type of people. If you recognize yourself in this sentence, it may be that one of your core qualities is a sense of responsibility. So, when you tilt your head and you see that from the core quality goes an arrow as a good supplement to challenge it. So your core quality by itself is a great feat, but in order for not to turn into a pitfall, we need a good supplement. And in order to help you find this supplement, you could come up with a motto. On the screen you can read, I want to keep my quality of responsibility and the responsibility I feel towards others, but I also want to use this for myself. So, in a sense, if you use this motto, you can always check at any moment in time if you're taking responsibility not just for other people, but also for yourself. If you're noticing that you're feeling too worried or you're feeling too stressed about the situation, are you also taking good care of yourself or not? So, we've walked through this model and we've thought about how to approach this, but it's also good to spend some time thinking about the possible positive consequences that this setting boundaries can give you. So, for an example, we could think about when setting a boundary has given you something positive. In a personal note, I always notice that whenever I close my working day, that the first 15 to 30 minutes I wouldn't be very interested in the world around me. I just needed a moment for myself. And whenever people try to claim space or hang out with me, which by itself is a great thing, I wouldn't be the best person. So at a moment, I set a boundary to take this time for myself, and after that time, be the sociable person I want to be. Which that gave to me is a moment to relax and to be a better person outside of these 30 minutes in my life. And it gave me the option to calm down again. We can also think about what happened if you didn't set enough boundaries. I think a lot of our people have noticed the moment that they took on a little bit too much workload. For example, when your manager asks you to do this task that you simply don't have the time for, but you took it on anyway. You noticed it in your shoulders and in your breath, and you were running out of time. And it's something that happened because your boundary wasn't either clear enough or it wasn't monitored well enough. So, when thinking about saying no to certain things, it's also good to take into account what positive consequences it may have. There's always a good reason to help someone else out. And if you have one of your core qualities that you want to be supportive towards other people, for example, a friend that needs help moving, it's also meant to take yourself and your own health into account. You are not worth much to someone else if you burn out in this sense. So, it's perfectly okay to take a step back, to take a break, and to say no to something, if that helps you out. So, how do we continue from this point on out? Fleur is going to walk you through some practical sides, the practical tips to help you set and monitor these boundaries.
Hi, my name is Fleur, and I'm a psychologist for Open Up. My colleague Jan just mentioned a few aspects about the subject setting boundaries, and I want to dig into this subject a little bit deeper with you. So what we will talk about is knowing your limits before you can set them. Also, we're going to talk about setting boundaries and motivation. We're going to see what kind of hindering thoughts we are. we have, and we're going to set boundaries in the right way and at the right time. So, but first of all, you must know your limits before you can set them. That sounds really logical, but it isn't that easy for everybody. So maybe it can help to think back of a situation where your limit was nearly reached. What happened to you? What did you feel? Personally, when I think back of a situation that reached my limit, I can notice that I get a little bit irritated, or maybe frustrated, or even angry. I also hear that back in a lot of consults I do for Open Up. People get angry or sad when their boundary is being crossed. So these are possible signals that you can recognize: irritation, anger, or sadness. So if you think back at a situation where you could feel those emotions, maybe it's good to analyze them a little bit more. So at what point did you feel that your boundary was being crossed? So if you do this more often, it can give you a better insight in what your limits are. The more you do it, the better you can feel when your limit is reached. Another thing that can help you set boundaries and feel when your boundary is reached is think about what is your motivation, because setting a boundary requires motivation. And values are an important part of our motivation. There's an American psychologist called Stephen Hayes, and he tells us that values are very important to direct us in our life. You can see them as our inner compass. So there are a lot of different values. Think about justice, equality, ambition or development, all kind of values that can be important to you. So let's, for example, think that ambition is really important to you. Imagine that you get the opportunity to get promoted at your job. If ambition is an important value to you, you will grab this opportunity with both hands, of course. But it also means that you have to give in on some other subjects. So maybe you have to set boundaries to live up to this value. So boundaries and motivation are really important, and they are connected to each other. So you also have short-term and long-term motivation, and there's a difference between those. Because sometimes we know in long term that something isn't really good for us, but as humans we are trying to seek for short-term satisfaction. So if we know that we could better say no to something because we are too busy, for example, instead we do the opposite and say yes because we want to be liked, for example. So in short-term and long-term motivation, there's a big difference. And also, again, these values can be a possible reason for that. So we know now what our limits are, and we also know the motivation behind it. But there can also be a lot of hindering thoughts in our way to set our limits. So let's have a closer look on those hindering thoughts. For example, you are very, very busy at work and your supervisor asks if you can take on another task. Hindering thoughts that come up can be, I can't do it, I have to do it, or if I don't do it, my supervisor will get angry. These thoughts come up automatically. We can't do anything about it, but we can challenge them and question them. Do these thoughts help you to set your boundaries? Well, probably not. So let's have a closer look. In this example, the hindering thoughts are, I can't do it, I have to do it, and if I don't do this, my supervisor will get mad. Are they helping or true? Well, the first one, I can't do it, could help maybe a little bit to set a boundary. But is it a very positive thought? Not really. And is it true? I'm not sure. So probably there is an alternative thought that could help us better. so I have to do it. Is that a helping thought or a true thought? Not really. And if I don't do this, my supervisor will get mad. Is that helping me to set my boundaries? Not at all. Is it true? Well, we don't know. Maybe your supervisor will get mad. But the question is that a bad thing? Is it the end of the world if your supervisor gets mad? So these are the alternative thoughts I thought of. I can't do it yet, so I can ask for help. This thought is way more positive than the other one. With these alternative thoughts, by the way, it's very important that they are credible for you. They have to be better than the thought you had, the hindering thoughts, more positive. And they need to help you and be credible. So I can't do it yet, so I can ask for help, is really credible for me. And it also helps me to set a boundary. For the second one, I do what I can and indicate what's not feasible, is also more helping than the other one. And the third one, if my supervisor gets mad, I can handle any anger. It isn't the end of the world when your boss gets mad. So, we know now what our limits are, and we can challenge our hindering thoughts. So it's time to really set the boundary. But of course, that sounds more easy than it is. We have to do it in the right way and at the right time. So it is important to think about how you're going to do it. But the good news is you can learn this by practicing. So I want to guide you through some rules that can help you set your boundary in the right way. Of course, every situation is different and needs another approach, but there are some rules that can guide you. I'll give you an example and I'll follow you in these rules. The example is this morning I came in the office and the kitchen was one big mess, and I want to set my boundary to that. It's very important that you use the I message. It's my frustration. I'm irritated, so I have to speak for myself. So in my example, hey, I noticed that this morning the kitchen was a big mess. Make it specific and not too personal. The more concrete you are, the better. So in my example, it could help to be a little bit more concrete. So this morning I was the first one arriving in the office, and I noticed that there were a lot of dirty cups, dirty plates in the kitchen, and the machine wasn't loaded. Try to avoid words as, oh, it's always a big mess when I come in the office, or you never clean up. That makes it too personal and it's a bit aggressive. Don't go over old ground. Maybe this happens more often. Maybe it happened 2 weeks ago as well. But as long as I didn't say something about it, they don't know that it's irritating me. So keep it in the now. It could also help to see the situation from another person's perspective. That's what we mean by leave the other in his or her own worth. Leave the other in his or her worth. Try to think maybe why the other person did what he or she did. In my example, maybe my colleague was really busy yesterday and she had to pick up her kids from daycare and was just in a big hurry. Leave others out. It's again my frustration, I'm irritated, so other people have nothing to do with it. Name the consequences for you. If I see what happened this morning with me, I came in the office, I had to clean up first, I had to clean the cups before I could grab a coffee. And it took me like 10 minutes, so I almost was late for my first meeting. So that's the consequence for me. Indicate what you do want. It's very easy to say what went wrong, But it could also help to have a look like what do you need from the other person? What do you want to change? In my situation, it's quite easy. I want, the kitchen to be cleaned. But not in every situation it is as easy as this. So it can really help to think of, okay, what do I need from the other person? Then listen to the other. Maybe the other has a good reason why he or she did it. In my example, exactly, she was really busy and had no time to clean up. That can happen. Then it's a good thing to anticipate to the response. So I tried to look for a solution that worked both for us. So I asked my colleague, okay, if you don't have time to clean up, maybe you could let me know, send me a text. So the next morning I can come to the office a little bit earlier and clean up a little bit and I'm not late for my meeting. So that were the steps or the rules about setting boundaries at the right way. We're going to look at setting boundaries at the right time now, because what is the right time exactly? Again, every situation is different, but there are some guidelines. You have to know the urgency of the situation. If it's urgent, try to act quickly. If you think your boundary is going to be crossed in the near future, it could help to manage expectations for later. To prevent is better than to cure. So try to manage expectations. And always make sure that it's never too late to discuss your boundary. If your boundary is being crossed in the past, you can always start a conversation about this, because it can help you restore the relationship, and it can also help prevent crossing the boundary in the future. So I said this before, if you're too emotional, if your emotion is really, really high, then it's better to wait a little bit before you set your boundary, because when you're too emotional, it's really difficult to start a conversation. So then it's better to wait till later in the afternoon or maybe the day after. And try to start the conversation one-on-one. If there's a lot of other people, the other person can feel threatened or attacked maybe. And the last one, it's really important to create the right context. And what I mean by that is that you really take time to make sure that your message is, being listened to. Okay, so we have all the ingredients now to set our boundaries. So it's time to work, and you can actively participate with this. So grab a pen of paper and write with me. What we will discuss. Is there a situation in which you want to indicate your boundary in the short term? Do you know your limits? Why is this boundary so important to you? And what thoughts do you encounter? How do you set your boundaries the right way? And what is the right time for you? So we're going to work with an example. I'm going to ask you certain questions, and you can make up your own example, and I will use mine. So is there a situation in which you want to indicate your boundary in the short term? There can be countless situations, but try to choose one which is important for you now. For me, it's a situation that happens quite often and is also, at the moment, a thing for me. I am very busy at work, and as a consequence, I have to work in the evenings. Do you know your limits? Well, you have to be aware of your boundary before you can communicate it. That's what we discussed. So, do you have signals you recognize? For me, I always recognize that my boundary is nearly crossed when I get frustrated and irritated. And especially at home, like my partner and my kids can recognize that. When I don't have control, when I don't oversee the situation anymore because I'm too busy, I get irritated. So try to think of signals that it's in case your situation. So why is this boundary so important to you? What is your motivation to set this boundary? Can you maybe recognize your values in this? For my own example, one of the things that are really important to me is quality. I want to do my job good, but I also want to be a good mother and a good partner. So quality is important. Also, downtime is really important to me. I like my work, I like my job, but I also like to spend time with family and friends. And the last one, what's really important to me, is that others know what they can expect from me. If I say yes to something, I want to make sure that I can follow up. What thoughts do you encounter? What kind of hindering thoughts come up when you think of your situation? And are they helpful? And are they true? In my own example, a lot of thoughts come up, but I picked one for you. I'm afraid that I will be judged, especially by my manager. Is that a helpful thought? No. Is it true? Not really, because in other situations, I set my boundaries before and I received positive feedback on this. So can I come up with an alternative thought? Yeah, well, I do what I can. I indicate what is not feasible, and I think along with alternative solutions. So how do you set your boundary in the right way? If you want, you can have another look at the tips a few slides back, but I will tell you my own experience now. Important parts of my message are the I message. So, like, I noticed that I find it difficult to do extra tasks and keep high quality. Then the other person's perspective, I understand that it's also difficult for you and that the work needs to be done. And what you do want, for the future, I would appreciate if you maybe involve me a little bit earlier so I can manage expectations. So what is the right moment? Have another look at the tips on the right moment. Flip a few slides back. Think about the urgency of the situations, the emotions, and if you can create a one-to-one moment. In my experience, the urgency was fairly high. There was a deadline the day after tomorrow, so I had to act quickly. I could manage my emotions pretty well. Like I said, my emotions are more in private life that I get frustrated or irritated than at work. So I created a one-to-one moment. I made an appointment with my manager tomorrow. So these were the steps, and I hope they were helpful for you to set your boundary. And I have a few more additional tips. And that's your attitude and non-verbal communication are really important. Like in every message, it really depends on your tone of voice, your volume, your facial expression, how your message is received. So be aware of that. And practice makes perfect. So when you have to learn new behavior, you have to do it a lot of times. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. Just say no as much as possible. And the last thing is, boundaries are not always set in stone. Some boundaries may be set in stone, like violence. For me, that's a big boundary. But like not every boundary is that clear. It really depends on how you feel, how you are, what are you doing, what's happening in your life. So it could also help to reflect a little bit more on how you're feeling. And that makes it a little bit easier to set boundaries. Okay. Hopefully this was helpful to you. We're going to go back to my colleague Jan now, and he's going to give you a small recap of what we discussed.
Okay, thank you, Fleur, for walking us through this practical side, and I hope it's helped you so far to help you set a balance. What we discussed today is that boundaries are important to maintain. It can be difficult to maintain them, and there's a difference between what's your concern, what's your involvement, and what's your influence over the situations. It's also important to help yourself, to challenge yourself in that sense, and why the positive sides of setting boundaries also need some attention, and that it is okay to say no at some point. Fleur walked you through a practical side, which you just saw, and provided you with some additional tips. And from here on out, Jesper will close the webinar from here on out.
Thank you for watching the webinar, How to Set Boundaries Both in Work and Personal Life. If you feel like you want to dive a little bit more into depth of a personal situation on how to set boundaries or another mental health challenge, feel free to book a consultation with one of our psychologists. If your employer offers Open Up, you can do so free of charge. Just go to www.openup.care. Next webinar will be about work stress, and we hope to see you there as well. Have a good day.